Hi, I'm Donovan, and this is episode 2 of Sex and Sacrament. This is the prelude. Pray? Why even bother? When I was still a pastor and theology professor, every time one of those tragic events of our time occurred, mass shootings, murdering innocent children, or natural disasters that take countless lives and leave survivors struggling years to rebuild, even total strangers, as if looking for their own answers, would ask me how and why I still would pray. After I came out, lost my career, my community, my marriage, my home, and had Christians direct hate speech and death threats at me, those questions took on a different, angry tone, especially from other people who were also rejected by religious families and community. How or why could I possibly believe in a loving God, a creator with conscious intention and purpose, when people suffer like this, especially when religious people are the ones causing the suffering? For me, this is no abstract debate. This isn't a professional problem of ministry or theology for me anymore. It never was. For me, it's always been a question of life and death. Long before I ever came out, I survived childhood assault and other forms of violence. Not just myself, but as a helpless witness to the abuse of my closest loved ones. Even as a young child, witnessing and experiencing human brutality turned me away from myself, closeting everything about myself. But it also turned me to, rather than away from God. As a very young, very introverted child in a violent, alcoholic home, I felt I had no other alternative but to pray to God. Even though I had been taught by my beloved, book loving parents that not only were religious beliefs unscientific and illogical, the people who claimed to follow them were obviously hypocrites. Now, without reservation, I agree. They were right. It isn't logical or rational for any educated, thoughtful, or even simply compassionate person to pray to a being who's alleged to be all powerful and all good in light of the existence of innocent suffering. And everyone who attempts it, including me, falls embarrassingly short of our best aims. But personally, I have to do it anyway, because regardless of what I was once taught, I have to believe there is somewhere, somehow, something greater than human brutality, that senseless violence doesn't ultimately get the final word, and that each individual human life isn't just a pointless and regrettable accident. No matter how much sense it makes to walk away from faith, rejecting God simply leaves me at an impasse. When I do the sensible thing, simply trying to muster on, living in the senseless violence of this world, assuming that tragic randomness is the only reality, it's just the way things are, I lose my will to live in this world, and I become ungrateful, sad, and reckless. My ability to function as a contributing adult comes to a screeching halt. That's just how it is for me. Some people are wired differently. I can genuinely admire the strength and courage of anyone who can live life on its own terms. But as for myself, I admit I'm too weak for that. Even now, when I try to be realistic, to live in this world just as it superficially seems to be, with people just as senseless, selfish, and violent as they so often show themselves to be, with no other meaning or hope, then depression and despair dangerously overwhelm me. Living and working now as I do in queer community, helplessness to protect those I care about is always present to my mind and heart. Young people cast into the poverty, danger, street life, and sex trafficking, rejected by their own parents. for being queer, for coming out. Trans women of color assaulted and murdered. Our queer family bullied to the brink of suicide. As someone who slips too easily into the most dangerous kind of depressive despair myself, the only way I can continue to live in this world where people do these things, especially when they do it in the name of love, God's love, is if I live as if there is a possibility that something greater than us exists. Whatever God may or may not be, faith in humanity alone does not seem like a better alternative. If God seems to fail at perfect goodness and power in light of human suffering and tragedy, so too does the humanity. Whether I embrace theism or atheism, nothing will change that. So my dilemma is a practical one. Just to continue each day to live in this world as it is, rather than denying reality. I pray constantly, even though it's obviously irrational. Because in order to live in this world of senseless tragedy, I myself, personally and practically, have to believe there is something more, an impulse toward life, love, goodness, healing, and creativity. I still sometimes call this God. Different words or images are equally inadequate. Like pin the tail on the donkey, they hit or they miss, struggling to land some word on that being, impulse, or force, or energy to describe an indescribable infinite, all that is, was, and ever will be. I still can't seem to get through a day meaningfully without self-destruction unless I let myself believe, as unreasonable as it is, that there is, or at least could be, something better than tragic human suffering and hate. I pray because I want to be in connection with that something better. While the senseless, selfish pettiness and tragedy of human life unfold around me, a dialogue of prayer streams through me, even asleep in many of my dreams, continually seeking that impulse to love and life and goodness that is behind, underneath, and in some way beyond the banality and senselessness of this world. That conscious and unconscious stream of dialogue with whatever is greater than humanity is what I mean by prayer. An ongoing way of being in the world, trying to keep one's spiritual finger on a different pulse, something more, something different than the way we normally see this world and our life together in it. Prayer is a stream of consciousness, ongoing response to human suffering, and an excuse for seeking to delight in God's creation, including other people, in spite of it. But so what? Where is this God when faith-shattering tragedies happen? For me, God is everywhere. If God is infinite, then God is in all places and times, all heres and nows, all at once, all the time. If one believes, as the people of the book, Jews, Christians, and Muslims do, that human beings are created in God's own image or likeness, this comes from Genesis 1 and 2, among other places, the Quran, then humans, reflecting that image of God, are created to be intrinsically and really free, like God. If time, too, is God's creation, then time cannot limit God in any way as it does us. Jesus spoke of the kairos of God's kingdom, a sense of being fully present here and now in this moment that contrasts with chronos, the human perception that time progresses or disintegrates in a linear sequence. So if God isn't bound by what we humans experience as a chronological time, linear time, then what seems future to us, that which our finite time-bound minds think God should prevent, because it hasn't happened yet, It already has and fully is in God's time. God is already there, light years ahead of us. All times just are for God. They are neither past nor future to the one who is equally present, omnipresent in all times. God is always present, even in fullness in the tragic events that seem to us bound in time as we finite beings are, as if they could be, for God, preventable. If God indeed made us free in God's own likeness and image, then we truly are free indeed. Free to commit and suffer violent, senseless, tragic acts in spite of God. God, who is that universal impulse toward love and all things better than we are. The real question is why people who could choose grace and love instead choose to reject and ignore that better than us impulse, that better heart pulsing under and in all of life, all the time. That is the question with which I struggle most each day. For whatever reason, free beings freely choose to ignore the one who is always there, the one who keeps luring us always toward what is best, even though we sometimes freely choose senseless tragedy and violence instead. To believe humans are free doesn't negate God's power, as some have argued. God is neither indifferent nor absent when we suffer or violate others, but rather we have the freedom not to perceive God, even though God is omnipresent. I see God with children being raped and adults being tortured, as a person who experienced those things myself. As present as feeling their terror in God's own self, God feeling their terror with them. I see God with grieving survivors, as present as feeling the anguish, confusion, and life-rending pain in God's own self. I see God, who is omnipresent and infinite, present, grieving, anguished, struggling with the rapist and the torturer too. The universal rhythm of love pulses in and around and under and beyond all of them, all of us, all the time, everywhere. For all of us, I pray. I don't know what prayer means other than that. I don't know that it changes anything other than the one who prays, but I hope that it does. That's all I can do. Pray and hope. Hoping that love wins. Believing irrationally in faith in what I have not yet seen.